We now have Mr. Ewing for a Snellville soundbite.
Thank you, Mayor. It's good to be back again after a short trip to overseas. I think I've lost it. Now here it is. Last presentation covered 1890 to 1900 and wound up with a few points to remember that Mr. Sawyer and Mr. Snell both had built new granite buildings by the turn of the century, in 1900. They had split. Other businesses had opened in town, including a couple of factories, a hat factory and a buggy factory. A doctor was well established in this community by that time. The first telephones had arrived, and the key people in town had the old crank-tight telephones. Mr. Snell, late of London, England, prominent pioneer merchant, died before 1900. And tonight I'm taking a little bit different tack rather than doing chronologically, and I'm going to continue with Mr. Snell and tell you what I know about his life. Mr. Snell and Mr. Sawyer being the most prominent talked about people, although I'm not sure they were the most prominent people, but they're the ones that built the store around which everything else grew, and certainly the publicity and the recognition that that's come their way they deserve. It's pretty hard to document the life of Mr. Joseph Thomas Snell. There's little published validated data or material, and there's no known published interviews of him. He had only one child. He had only one grandchild and one great-grandchild. So there's not a large family emanating from Mr. Joseph Thomas Snell. He was born on December 25th, 1856, about 5 years before our Civil War began, in Cornwall, England, according to published family history. He had 5 sisters and no brothers. Nothing is known about his early life, but as a teenager, he acquired a job in a store in London. And there he became friends with 2 other young teenagers by the name of Charles and James Sawyer. Now, as teenagers will, they made a lot of plans. Air castles, my mother used to call it. Together they began to dream of traveling far, far away. Being young boys, that was not at all unusual. I remember talking about things like that when I was a kid. His family probably scoffed at him. But in their case, it was more serious. It was much more serious. They made plans. They made serious plans. Plans to come to America. How many of you have got children 17 years old? They were less than 17 years old at that time. Why America? One family story says they dreamed of going to America and going out west and joining in the Indian wars, fighting the Indians. The adventure. Can you see teenage boys just thinking about this? Sounds like an adventurous thing that I might have wanted to do at one time when I didn't have any better sense. They planned their transportation the only way they could. In those days, by ship. Now I have with me a letter Mr. Earl Snell gave me, and I blew it up. This is a letter written by Tom Snell to his friend James before they left England, and I'm going to read you some excerpts from it to show you how close they were, or thought they were. It was written on the 12th of January, 1874. I passed the store today, Monday, 11 a.m., and stopped some 10 or 15 minutes in hope of seeing your precious self. Result, you know. I wished it would rain rifles and revolvers to get you, to bring you out. Sounded like kids doing it. Okay, he didn't finish the letter, so he started over a day or so later. Dear Jim and Charlie, I hope you spend a Merry Christmas. I wonder what kind of Christmas we shall spend next Christmas, and a Happy New Year. But I fear we shall not spend our New Year so happy as we anticipated. I hope you will never forget the vow we made to go to America together and be two true friends to each other as long as we live, no matter how far or how long we are separated from each other. I shall never forget you or the determination we have made. I hope you're both of the same opinion as when I left. Apparently he has had to leave the store for some reason, and I think that had to do with his parents finding out that they were planning a trip to America. Anyhow, the second sentence is, I am, meaning he's still of the same opinion. He still didn't finish the letter. He started over again later. I conclude with my best wishes to you and Charlie. Believe me, dear Jim, to remain your true friend, J.T. Snell, Tom. So you can see, from Snell's point of view, they had a pretty close relationship. Well, Snell's parents woke up. His parents had caught on, and as any parents might do, they intervened. So when time came to leave, he had to sadly watch his two friends get on the ship and go, and he had to stay. But several months later, either with his parents' blessings or without, he followed his friends to America. I wonder if having 5 sisters had anything else to do with his decision to leave. Now, 17 years old, his friends are already in America, and he has to travel alone by himself. I don't have any real pictures of him, but what happened? Okay, but I cropped this off the script that they made right after they opened their business, and this, I believe, is a picture of young Snell at some time before he immigrated to America. And that's, as I say, cropped off the script that they had. He arrived in New York in early August 1874. 17 years old. He'd been in touch with the Sawyers by mail, who had arrived earlier. I'll talk about that at a later time. And they were already down here in Georgia, over in Madison County near Isla, Georgia. So Snell joined them. Now, reality began to set in, I'm sure. It's a long way out west of where the Indians are. And one must eat and have shelter and perhaps replace the clothing. They were willing to work wherever they could find it. So they worked a lot as day laborers along the way. They were in the midst of our agricultural economy, so where else was they going to find a job? A farm, of course. Now, these are young boys that grew up in London, England, and were working in the store, and what did they know about farm work, which 6 to 8 years ago in the large plantation areas was being done by, unfortunately, slaves. Now, certainly it was something new and strange to them, but I don't see that they had much other choice. That was all available. They had these. So after a short time, whether they didn't like the job they had, or the job ran out, or he fired them, or whatever, they headed southwest out of Madison, Georgia. But first they purchased themselves a shotgun. I suppose the idea was to kill game in the fields and woods along the way for much needed food. They were walking, of course, and it happened that they were traveling through Lawrenceville on a Sunday afternoon, walking down the middle of the street, and a group of boys hanging around town, as boys are prone to do, started taunting these strangers who were dressed probably a little bit different than they were. And one of the Sawyer boys, wanted to take on that crowd. The other two decided that was not a good idea, and he talked them out of it. So they moved along without having any big Donnybrook there in the middle of Lawrenceville. But Mr. Sawyer thought enough about that to talk about it later on. Soon they found a job at another farm. Now, way up in some of the first briefings I gave, I talked about the largest landowner in this area, in this particular area, and his name was Mr. A.G. Holmes. That was before the Civil War, and that was. Well, they wound up at Mr. A.G. Holmes' farms. Now, basically, the home place was over on what is today Webb Gin House Road. And that farmland ran from Webb Gin House Road past where the hospital is over here today. Then it turned the other direction, went over towards Oak Road. They worked for him, and I don't know where. They were grubbing new ground. If you don't know what grubbing new ground is, that's hard work. I've done some of it. It's digging stumps, and it's digging up the roots after the stumps are gone, and it's going back and digging the rocks up, and that sort of thing. That's what they were doing for Mr. Holmes. Now, turns out Mr. Holmes decided not to pay him. So they hired him a lawyer. They were a lot smarter than the local boys, had a little better education, I suspect. They hired him a lawyer. They went to court, and they won, and he lost. He had to pay him. He took it. He appealed it, went to higher court, and they won, and he lost. Then they moved on. Do you know where Head Elementary School is? That's known as the Dyer Farm over in that area. It was known as Captain Dyer because he was a captain in the Confederate Army, and a lot of people they were referred to by their rank when they came back, particularly if they were a captain or above. Anyhow, they went to work for Captain Dyer, and they worked for him for some time. Now, the boys began to get restless. Things wasn't going like they thought they were, and they weren't out west fighting Indians. So one of the Sawyer boys left and went back up north. Don't know why. And soon after, his brother left to try to find him. They had lost touch with him. Well, guess what? Young Snell is along by himself again in a foreign country with no support base, no family. He had to make his friends as he went. We don't know exactly how he survived during that period. We suppose he just continued to work for Mr. Dyer. And there's an indication he got some jobs over around Norcross. But what we do know is 2 years after he got here in 1876, he got married. By himself. He was alone. In 1877, his first and only child was born while they were living in a dirt floor log cabin. How many 17-year-olds do you know now that can take on that responsibility? When the children are born, of course, he's not yet 20 years old, and his young wife, is not yet 17. Now, later on, we have reason to believe that he bought the stock of a country merchant. We don't know where, but it was not in Snellville. About 1878, about the year after his child was born. In 1879, he moved to the Crossroads, and he built and opened the first store. It is always said that Mr. Sawyer and Mr. Snell built and opened the store. Not so. Mr. Snell built the first store. Mr. Sawyer came back from up north before 1880. And the reason we know that is in the Snell household in the 1880 census. was Mr. Snell, his wife, his daughter, and one boarder named James Sawyer. So Sawyer has come back from up north, but Snell had already opened the business. Folklore doesn't make that very clear, but when you start looking at the records and you lay it all out, it becomes very clear what occurred. Okay. Both Sawyer and Snell are listed as merchants in that 1880 census. Remember the letter? What he said, let's remain friends forever? Well, they're now living in Snell's house, and they're working together. And he said, friends for life. Sawyer left him alone, went up north, came back, and Snell took him in. About 79 or 80, they formed their partnership. But first, I want to remind you what that is an actual photograph of Joseph Thomas Snell's home, and probably at the time it was built long before Sawyer's. It's probably the finest home in this community. I think he bought the house and then remodeled it, but I can't say that for sure. The house at this time was in very bad shape. It had been, the Snells had been gone a long time. It had been used as a rental house for quite a while. And as you can see, electricity's already here, so I know this is after 1937 because there's a meter box on the side of the house there, although there's not a meter on it. But many, many different families lived in that house later. But that was Mr. Joseph Tom Snell's home. Now, about 1879 and 80, Mr. Snell had taken Mr. Sawyer in, and they formed their business partner. And folklore says they called it in the community New London. They probably did. All the family says that was so. But we know that the county paper in 1882, their ad in the paper says Snellville. So we know by that time it has already been settled that this is Snellville. And the post office followed that, the name Snellville. Now they were in business for several years together, did quite well. Then they split. Mr. Snell sold out to Sawyer and built his own separate business across the corner. You've seen this picture before, and that's the store that Mr. Snell built. Now, I believe there are only two people that knew why they broke up, and that's Tom Snell and Jim Sawyer. There are several stories. There are stories that Snell took shoes and clothing without paying for them. He was quite a dresser, they said. There are stories that Snell went to England to buy stock and failed to do so. There were stories of a disagreement and a fist fight, and others. His great-granddaughter was still living about 6 months ago. And I contacted her, and she's kind enough to respond to me. She lives in Cartersville, Georgia. The great-granddaughter states that after Mr. Snell returned from a serious operation in Atlanta Hospital, he asked for the store books. After reviewing them, he found what he believed to be questionable entries, and an argument ensued. Snell asked Sawyer to leave, and soon afterward came the breakup. It's not unusual when friends go into a business partnership. Often they soon are no longer friends. And I think that may be what happened there. Well, so much for the letter and the Friends for Life. Now you're talking about the early 1900s, 1993, 1994. I'm running a little long, I know. Snell starts a new business across the street, and he was very successful. And I've covered a lot of that before, so I'm not going to refinish it tonight. Now, how about Snell's siblings, all his sisters? All his sisters except one eventually came to America. Two of them at least came through Snellville. Three of them came through Snellville. One of them stayed here. One of them is the mother of the man right over here that's the first mayor of Snellville. The other three probably settled in Wisconsin. I know that part of the family was up there. Now what I want to do is I want to read you the obit of Mr. Snell, and I read you excerpts from it before. But this kind of tells a story here. If you're interested in the Snells, you need to hear this. This is the Gwinnett Herald County paper, Snellville, March 3rd, 1896. Many of our readers will be surprised to learn that this well-known citizen in our county, one of the leading merchants and most enterprising businessmen, died in Atlanta Friday from the effects of a surgical operation by Dr. Holmes, one of the most experienced surgeons in the state. I remember before I told you there were stories about he was operated on the kitchen table and this and that. Here it is. His remains were brought to Lawrenceville last Saturday and carried to his home in Snellville, attended by a large concourse of friends. His family had his remains embalmed, and that was not a common thing in the 1890s. His family had his remains embalmed, and the burial will not take place until sometime this week. The funeral has been postponed until a vault can be built where he will be deposited instead of a grave. That didn't happen. We are not informed at this writing of what time the burial service will be conducted. Mr. Snell's career in this county has been an eventful one and shows what can be accomplished by energy and devotion to business, and is an example for our young men starting out on the journey of life may study with profit. A few years after the war, Tom Snell, Mr. Sawyer, and another young Englishman arrived in Gwinnett. Without friends or acquaintances, they began life here. Young, energetic, and hopeful, they sought work. One of the first jobs they found was to do grubbing in new ground for Mr. Green Holmes. While they had no experience in the business and had probably never dug a stump, they went to work with a will. Having furnished this, they sought other work and found it, as men always will, that are ready to do good honest work. After living in this county a year or two, Mr. Snell entered into the mercantile business as a clerk, then a partner, and subsequently opened a small store at the crossroads. He opened a store at the crossroads, where the town of Snellville is located. He flourished in business, and the crossroads became a town that had a large mercantile business. The post office was named after him, and it will be known a century to come as Snellville, and it has now been over a century. Mr. Snell prospered in business and accumulated property. He built a large rock storehouse, bought lands, and his estate today is probably worth $10,000. That don't sound like much, does it? In 1896, $10,000 was a lot of money. He made this his permanent home, married here, and no man in the county had brighter prospects for the future. Several years ago, an abscess formed on his liver. Now we're going to get the history of his medical thing, which by the skill of Dr. Westmoreland was removed and his life was saved, when even his physician regarded it as a very delicate and dangerous operation. 1896, I'm sure it was. A month or two ago, an abscess formed on his bowels, and a week ago he went to Atlanta to have it removed. Hoping for the best, yet fearing for the worst, he made all his arrangements. Let the result be what it would, and death came. Mr. Snell was a member of the Methodist Church, a public-spirited citizen, and a man whose influence for goodwill will be missed in his community. He leaves a wife, a daughter, sisters, and a large concourse of friends to mourn his unexpected demise. The Herald tenders his sympathies to the bereaved. Well, that's as close as you're going to get it. If it's a reporter's take on it, and it is not folklore. He was only 39 years old. Now, one can easily conclude that Mr. Snell had what we in the South call spunk. That he was a smart businessman and that he was compassionate with his family and his friends. He was buried in the family plot that he had planned on the mountain above his home. His great-granddaughter said he told his wife if he made it through the operation and regained his health, that he would build them a home up on the mountain near where he had planned for the burial ground. But if he did not make it, he wanted to be buried there. And he was. And I told you the last time, his family later made the decision to have his grave moved to Lithonia, where all are buried together. Mr. Snell, this is his wife, this is his daughter, and her husband. They were in business in Lithonia. And those graves are side by side down there in the Lithonia City Cemetery, and his mother-in-law is in between these two graves. Mr. Snell, in compared to Mr. Sawyer, always seemed to be a step ahead of Mr. Sawyer. Now, I'll talk about Mr. Sawyer next week, and if there's any of his family out here, I'm not taking sides, I'm just telling it the way it is. There's probably out here somewhere some Snell descendants and some Sawyer descendants. The Georgia Tax Digest in 1896 shows that Mr. Snell owned 1,070 acres of land. In addition to his store and his business. 39 years old. He came here in 1874. This is 1896. You can only speculate what other contributions he might have made to the community had he lived, or what other business investments that he might have made that might have been successful. He had a grandson that came here and lived from about 1929 until he died. His name was Tom Snell Johnson. His house burned. It was down on 124 when it burned. And in that fire, since he was the only only living descendant, went all the family heirlooms and all the history of the family. And that's why it's so hard to document the thing. Mr. Tom Snell Johnson earned the majority of his income, I am told, by managing the assets that he inherited from his grandfather and his mother had protected, and those of his mother and his father down in Lithonia. His great-granddaughter was still living about 6 months ago, but her health, she was in declining health. She's in her 90s. She lives in Cartersville. So I'm going to leave you with 5 points. He came from England alone. He had planned it with his two friends, but he came alone. He joined his friends in the late summer of 1874 in Madison, Georgia, Madison County. The Sawyers then left him alone and went up north for a while. alone again. He married, he had a child, and he started a business. And he prospered. And when his friend Sawyer returned, Snell welcomed him into his home and into the business with him. His untimely death in 1896 at the age 39. And we don't know what might have been had he lived as long as Sawyer did. Anyone have any questions? I apologize for running a little long. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Ewing. We now have committee